Good morning, everybody. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives presentation of digital imaging. Today's presenters are Monica Hauck-Whealton and Vincent Commisso. Monica is Records Advisory Officer for counties, libraries, and miscellaneous governments, and Vincent is with our scheduling and state agency services. And at this point, I just want to point out that the session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. If you have any questions at all during this session, please type them in the chat box to the right side of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And now I will turn it over to Vincent.
Thanks, Rich. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about digital imaging. Are you thinking about converting your paper records to digital format? By the end of this session, you'll have a better understanding of what that entails, when it's a good idea, and where to begin. We're going to start by providing an overview of what exactly we mean by digital imaging and when and why it might be worth your while to do it. Then we'll give you some ideas on how to plan your project, including options for who should do the imaging and provide quick tips for project success. This is an overview and introduction. In the Q&A, we can dig a little deeper. So let's define our terms. What is imaging? Imaging is the act of turning a physical or paper copy of a record into an image of the record that can be shared or accessed in non-paper format such as a computer file, microfilm, or microfiche. Essentially, you're taking a photograph or taking a picture of a physical record. I apologize, by the way, if there's background noise. There's construction going on here around the building. If you're turning a paper document or an image on microfilm, microfiche, or other physical object into a computer file, that's digital imaging. So, why is this exciting? When talking about records management with state agencies and local governments, digital imaging often comes up as a current, an ongoing, or proposed project. Why? First, we all have limited physical space available to us, and who wouldn't like the idea of dedicating less of it to files? Electronic copies also allow access from any location with internet access, including when you're telecommuting or doing a site visit. Because electronic copies can be accessed by multiple people at the same time, you don't need to wait until someone else is done with a document or determine who is using the record so that you can retrieve it or borrow it to make another copy, which will have limited short-term value. If your records are in paper format and there's a disaster, a fire, a flood, a building collapse, infestation, or contamination event, you may lose your paper records completely or be required to spend time and money retrieving, stabilizing, cleaning, and potentially reproducing those impacted records. With electronic records, if you've backed them up recently, you can simply retrieve a copy and only worry about reproducing the most recently created or edited content. Storing records electronically can also make it easier to retrieve records because you can describe them in multiple ways. Say you have a contract with a vendor. If you store it in a physical format, you have to choose one primary way of describing and identifying it, say by contract number or vendor name or item or service description. With digital copies, you can associate all of these identifiers and more with a single document without having to create a many-layered filing scheme. There's even more reasons to be excited. With so many records being created and maintained in electronic format, it sounds appealing to store everything the same way, especially when you realize that electronic copies can be accessed quickly from within or outside of the office without having to physically go to a filing room or cabinet or travel to offsite storage. Having most of your records available in digital format turns records retrieval into one-stop shopping. Additionally, having records in electronic format can make it easier to review, edit, and approve content. It can also make responding to access requests from the public so much easier. If you watched a webinar that Monica's hosted, you probably already know that she used to be a records access officer. This means that she needed to hunt down and provide access to records requested under the Freedom of Information law. If the record was available electronically, she could grab it in seconds without having to leave her desk. If it was in paper format, she'd either have to visit the file room, which wasn't bad. We all like a trip to the file room once in a while. Request it from offsite storage, took longer but was still pretty easy, or identify the person most likely to have the record and pass the retrieval chore on to them. With variable results, as her colleagues not only had more than enough other obligations to fill their days, but were often out of the office for site visits. Digitizing records also opens up the possibilities for creating self-service resources for the public or utilizing existing ones like data.ny.gov. Sure, you'll still receive direct requests for records, even those available through self-service, but you may be able to reduce overall the resources dedicated to responding to such requests. In theory, it should free you up to do other things that you'd rather be doing or need to be doing. Not only is it quicker to find the records if they're available electronically and appropriately organized, but you're also saving the step of scanning or photocopying them for release. If you have the requester's email address and the record doesn't contain any protected content, you can simply drag it into your reply. And of course, digitizing paper records means that you may, sorry for the noise, be able to move the paper copies to a less accessible, less valuable, less expensive storage space, or after proper verification, which we'll get into later, destroy them completely. Monica, here we go.
Thanks, Vincent. So this all sounds pretty exciting, right? But nothing is ever that easy. As fantastic as this all sounds, imaging isn't the perfect solution for every office, record, or situation. For example, it's so much easier to permanently lose electronic records than paper ones. I know it sounds odd, but look at it this way. You're always going to have a paper copy so long as it stays within the office, even if you can't find it right now, unless or until there's a disaster or somebody tosses it in the trash, recycling, or shredder, it's retrievable, and you can often identify it at a glance. Electronic records can go missing and like their paper counterparts, but it's a little different. Like, say you have a file in the wrong folder, or you give it a really non-descriptive name. Like those of us who have been around a few decades may remember back in the 80s when we were struggling to come up with unique 8-character file names for all of our computer files. Or you could index a record or add metadata to the description incorrectly or incompletely. Once a file is in the wrong place or given an undescriptive name, it's difficult, if not impossible, to find it again. Even if you describe and file an electronic record correctly, it can still go poof, never to be seen again. Files become corrupted, often with no warning. Hardware and storage media fail, again, often with little or no warning. And that doesn't even take into account user error issues, like spilling your coffee on your laptop, which can quickly turn it into a very expensive object lesson. Or your files can remain in good accessible order, and your flash drive, laptop, CDs, DVDs, and whatnot don't fail, but instead go missing outside the office or be stolen. You can lose thousands of files and years worth of work because your flash drive fell out of your bag while you were rooting around for your wallet to pay for your lunch. And nobody wants to live that nightmare. It's bad enough the time I lost my ID while I was paying for lunch. I don't want to have to lose my files too. This all means that when creating and storing records electronically, you need to think very carefully about how you're going to ensure that they remain accessible. This means creating filing schemes and naming conventions and training staff on how to use them. It's also important to make sure that you have the necessary resources to ensure ongoing access before initiating a digitization project. For example, you'll need to plan to back up your electronic records regularly and routinely migrate content from old or less secure storage devices to those less likely to fail or go missing. You'll also need to convert records in older file types that are no longer popular to others that are still widely accessible. These actions require time and the support of your colleagues in IT. You're also going to want to consider whether your coworkers will think that this is as good an idea as you do. You may think that digitizing your records is going to radically improve office operations and have significant positive impacts on the majority of staff, but unless your colleagues agree with you, and are willing to put in the time, effort, and in the case of management and fiscal staff, budget the required funding and staff time, your project may be doomed before it even begins. Before initiating a digital imaging project, make sure that you can provide accurate, convincing answers to the following questions. Is there a business process that will be improved by imaging a specific record type or category? Do we have, or can we acquire, the tools needed to convert, describe, store, and preserve records? Which records need to be accessed quickly, frequently, or remotely? Which records must be backed up? Are the records in danger of being damaged by normal handling? And do we, or should we, be describing records in multiple ways? If the answer is no, reconsider whether digital imaging is for you. As I said, imaging isn't the perfect solution for every records management situation. You might be better off going a different route if you don't have the technical expertise, funds, or equipment needed to create good quality images or ensure they remain accessible for the full retention period, don't need to access the records often or quickly, don't need to retain the records for very long, or if your office culture doesn't support it. One argument for digitizing records that we hear a lot, and that sounds better than it really is that it'll allow you to dispose of paper records, freeing up storage space. While this can be a great side benefit, it usually isn't sufficient cause to launch a digitization program. Everything that we've talked about so far, or will talk about during this session, costs money and staff time. In fact, it might cost enough in funds and time that it'll actually be less expensive to keep less frequently accessed records in offsite storage. You should also think about how you're storing your paper records. File boxes on shelves store content more compactly than filing cabinets, and compressed shelving is not only fun to use, but very space efficient. You're also going to want to consider whether you really need to save all the stuff currently in storage. Are you destroying records that are past their disposition date? How regularly? Are duplicate copies making it into the files? Just like how you're not supposed to go out and buy storage bins before you go through the stuff cluttering your basement to determine what you really need or want to keep, you shouldn't make decisions based upon current volume of paper records until you're sure that you actually need to keep or want to keep them all for a lengthy period of time. If you could have gotten rid of it 3 years ago, there are better, faster, easier, and cheaper ways of making space than digitizing. Another possible benefit of imaging records that sounds better, or at least easier than it is the ability to perform keyword searches on documents post-scanning. While this is technically possible through optical character recognition, or OCR, of typewritten records, or intelligent character recognition, or ICR, of typewritten records, and may be a great secondary indexing method for things like board minutes, successful use depends on a high level of accuracy. As Vincent mentioned, I used to be a records access officer. And this meant that in the course of responding to FOIL requests, I OCR'd a ton of records so that I could auto-redact certain keywords and character string types. And let me tell you, it's only a moderate time savings. Character recognition is not perfect. And even if it's near perfect, say 99.9% accurate, that still opens up the possibility of 2 errors per 2,000 character page. Multiply that by the number of pages that you intend to image, and that's a ton of failed character recognition attempts. And it only gets worse if you're trying to recognize handwriting. I can't always read my own handwriting, as embarrassing as that is, or that of people that I've known for decades. Why would I expect a computer to do it perfectly? Because of this, while it may very well be worth running character recognition, it can't be used as your only indexing method. And even if character recognition was perfect, it shouldn't be used as your only indexing method because if you go through documents, there are likely to be many more mentions of a specific character series or string than references to your topic of interest. A word may come up much more frequently in reference to many more issues or topics than than it be mentioned in your particular context. If few minutes ago, we mentioned the possibility of getting rid of paper records post-imaging, and I'm sure a lot of you got really excited about that. The good news is that in many circumstances, you can replace a paper copy with a digital copy for record-keeping purposes. Before doing that, though, there are a few things that you got to do. First, you have to verify that your particular record isn't one of the exceptions to the normal rules. If you receive or produce records for submission to or on behalf of another government entity, like if you're a clerk managing court records, you may need to receive permission from the document owner before imaging records and disposing of the paper originals. Oversight entities and those documenting certain transactions, like DMV's issuance of vehicle titles, may also identify certain records that must be retained in their original paper format. And of course, there are other record types that might have legal or historical value that precludes destruction of paper originals. When in doubt, talk to the entity that issued the document, legal counsel, or state archive staff. One of the things I always like to talk to counsel about, or did when I was a records management officer, is which documents with wet signatures need to be retained in paper format. And it really varied because sometimes, if something was notarized or if it's a contract, the folks I worked with were very conscientious about keeping the paper copy for the full retention period. But it really depends on the document type, how it's used, and how the local courts view paper records versus electronic records. Because even, if there are laws in place, sometimes people have preferences and your counsel is going to know those preferences better than you do. So always talk to your counsel. Another thing to keep in mind is that local government records created prior to 1910 cannot be destroyed without first receiving the approval of the state archives. And then there are some records like maps, plans, and drawings that contain details that won't transfer clearly to a digital image. The same might be true about records that have seals affixed to them or embossed on them. You're also going to want to verify that any image created, no matter what kind of document it is an adequate substitute for the paper copy and will remain accessible for the full required retention period. We'll get into that in detail in a little bit. So having seen that we're going to talk about micrographics, y'all are either wincing or excited. I'm guessing if you've used micrographics before, there may be a little bit of wincing going on. But no discussion of file formats would be complete without a mention of microfilm and other micrographics. If you're imaging records to create a backup copy and don't intend to access it very frequently, micrographics may be a really great format for you. But why? Well, microfilm, microfiche, and other micrographics are long-lived. Depending on the type of film and the condition under which it's stored, those records, once on micrographic media, may still be accessible in 500 years. I mean, we don't even know if our, government entities are still going to be organized as they are currently in 500 years. But, when I say that, keep in mind that the technology is not 500 years old. It's far from it. So this is just an estimate, and it hasn't been fully tested yet. Micrographics are also compact. You can store about a cubic foot's worth of standard office paper on a single roll of microfilm. And you can fit about 90 reels of 16 millimeter microfilm in a single cubic foot box, which means that the records that were previously taking up 90 boxes worth of space may only take up 1 box worth of space, which is obviously an astounding savings. Micrographics are also eye-readable. This means that if the electricity is out or your microfilm reader is down and you really need to verify the information on a microfilmed document, you can look at the content that you need with the help of just a low-tech magnifier and a light. And because micrographics are physical media, you don't need to worry about software updates or file formats becoming obsolete. But I mentioned some of you might be wincing, and that's because even though they're micrographics are a great way to store certain types of records, there are definitely reasons why digital copies are probably preferable for frequently accessed content. With micrographics, you're going to have an awful time finding what you need if you don't have a terrific index. Although that said, you definitely want to have a great index for your digital records too. but going through a roll of microfilm to find an individual document when you don't know where on the film it is really labor intensive and really frustrating. While micrographics are iReadable, you probably don't want to be using your handheld magnifier unless there's no other option. Plus, there are going to be times where you need a copy of the document rather than just the information on it. And micrographics readers, even though they let you retrieve the document in relative comfort and make a copy of it if necessary, can be a bit of a pain in the neck to use. Plus, it's getting more and more challenging to find vendors who sell the readers and the replacement parts needed to keep them in good working order. But let's say you're thinking, how about I make microfilm now, and then later I'll convert it to digital records. Well, while that's certainly a possibility, the images created from the microfilmed content may not be as legible as if you had just digitized the paper originals. And then finally, microfilm and other micrographics, like computer files and the media on which they're stored, can fail. The difference is that while digital media, if a file fails, it's not going to take the rest with it. Some older types of microfilm, mostly from the early 1980s and earlier, can break down chemically in a way that damages both itself and unaffected film stored nearby. So you can have one roll of microfilm that goes bad, and it starts outgassing, and you don't notice it, you don't pick up the smell, you don't go into that room very quickly, and before you even know there's a problem, you can have an entire shelf or an entire room full of microfilm that's starting to degrade, and you're having to rush to stabilize it, to replicate it, to pull that information so that it's not lost. And on that cheerful note, I'm going to hand you back to Vincent.
Thanks, Monica. And let's not get too cheery just yet. Monica's kind of sparked my imagination, made me think of a few things. So before I delve into how to increase your chances of success, I'm just going to change the slide here. I want to briefly build on something she just said and add something else for you to consider, along with everything else, as though that wasn't enough, that I've heard people reference when weighing all of this out. As Monica alluded to, microform, that is microfilm and microfiche, is a technology that is roughly a century old and, well, being much better now than when it was originally developed. And for those of you who've seen microfilm of yesteryear and compared it to more recent microfilm, you know what I'm talking about. It is still quite young relative to paper. And of course, we have to keep in mind that paper manufacture processes have themselves changed over time, with consequences for how long the paper will last. But that's even more true of electronic records, and we shouldn't forget that despite the conveniences, the technological infrastructure behind electronic records is a very, very recent vintage itself. So that's one thing to keep in mind, right? It's still a relatively recent technology. The further consideration that I want to mention, that is usually mentioned as a reason to digitize or scan records, is the positive environmental impact this process has in the form of fewer trees cut down to produce the paper. So yes, less paper should mean fewer trees are cut down, and that's hard to argue against, and I don't want to do that. But we also do need to recognize that electronic records are not environmentally neutral either. The electricity needed to power the computers to access these records, to power the scanners to digitize them in the first place, that is assuming that they're not born digital, right? That they're not created electronically in the first place, and to power the servers where these records are stored and retrieved from, also known as the cloud. With these servers themselves are often found in dry, hot climates. Much, if not most, of that electricity is produced via fossil fuels. In addition to this, those servers get hot and need to stay cool. And while there may be methods of cooling that I'm unaware of, I'm sure there are, one that I am aware of involves utilizing copious amounts of fresh water, all just to keep the servers cool and the data flowing. If you're looking to fully and truly and accurately assess paper versus microform micrographics versus electronic records in as objective a way as possible, these kinds of things would also have to be taken into account to the extent that you can. And I suspect increasingly will be taken into account as time moves on, right? The goal is not to dissuade you, but the goal is to have you consider everything that's as much as possible that's in play here that would have bearing on your decisions. So it's all the more important to be strategic in terms of what you decide to digitize, to scan. But let's say you've done all that considering and you're comfortable with it and you've decided to do a digital imaging project. I've done some myself. Hooray! Where do you start? First, the most important choice that you can make to ensure project success is to start small. You want to prove to your organization and to yourself, especially if you're just starting out, that your goals are achievable and that your colleagues and constituents will benefit from meaningful improvements as a result of the project. This is best done by limiting the scope of your project to minimize the time needed to complete it and, hopefully, the number of challenges that you will encounter along the way. Once staff are comfortable with the whole digital imaging thing, you can get more ambitious. Better to start small and succeed famously than to go big and fail miserably. So, when selecting records for imaging, try to choose the test cases that will give you the most bang for your buck. These are probably going to be records that are retained in the long term, something that you'll be retaining for 10 years or longer, rather than those that can be disposed of after only, say, 6 years. You're also going to want to focus on the records that staff will need to access post-conversion. Imaging records can be a good idea for certain content types that you won't access frequently. More on that in a moment. But for your test case, you want to realize immediate observable benefits for as many people as possible, right? If you do that, you're going to be more likely to persuade them that this is a good idea. One of those instances where you might want to image records that aren't pulled frequently is if they haven't been backed up and staff are concerned about future accessibility. Giving staff peace of mind by ensuring that necessary information will still be available after a disaster is another great near immediate benefit of imaging the right records. Can't put a price on peace of mind, right? So right now, you might be the only vocal advocate of an imaging program. For your program to succeed, you're going to have to change that. When selecting records for a test case, consider who is most likely to be a willing, open-minded project participant. This may mean picking folks who already have a certain level of comfort or expertise with electronic records and will face a less steep learning curve when acquiring new skills. You should also consider which individuals or units are most likely to be outspoken about the benefits they realized through the project, how easy it was to adapt to the new process, and how helpful they found records management staff. Basically, you want to work with people who are going to sing from the rooftops. So, good candidates. Records that are good candidates for imaging projects includes those that are limited in scope. As I said, keep things simple. Those that are easy to describe. You're going to want to start with content that can be described effectively using only a few index terms. And by these, I mean those pieces of data which you use to organize and locate the records. For example, say last name, date of birth, and other such signifiers. Folks who still aren't sure what they're getting into aren't going to want to populate a bunch of descriptive fields for every file created. So keep it simple, keep it brief. If you can find it with just a couple of index terms, just do those. You don't need to do every single field found on a form. That's probably a waste of your time. The goal is to find the thing, not describe it perfectly all the way through. The more frequently a file is shared or accessed, the more quickly staff get used to using digital copies and the more time savings that are realized. So, some possible places to begin. Records types that may meet these criteria include, and start thinking about the records you have now, picture it in your mind's eye, case files, contracts and agreements, those which aren't expired and those which are longer term, right? Sometimes I've seen situations where people want to digitize just contracts that are sitting there and you say, well, these contracts are expired. You could have disposed of these, and people just didn't do it. So you always want to make sure that these are things that are, still relevant. Meeting minutes, resolutions, and ordinances. Personnel records, these need to be kept for a long time and people do come back looking for them. Procurement and fiscal documentation. And last but not least, anything that's foiled frequently that doesn't require redaction. I've been part of digitization projects, billing records, of marriage records, which were frequently requested back when I worked in local government. There's a lot of, which have to be kept permanently as well. There's a lot of different places to begin. All right, Monica, here we go.
Thanks, Vincent. So I'm going to make a statement that sounds really obvious, but your digital records are only going to be valuable if you can retrieve them when they're needed. I mean, why else put in this time and effort and funding? So that means when planning, oh, sorry, I didn't advance. When planning your project, you're going to want to consider where the documents are going to live. To start, you might want to use a local area network. For greater functionality, you might want to purchase a system specifically designed to manage electronic records. There are all sorts of flavors of these, from those that only manage scanned records or don't apply records retention rules, to those that will manage all your electronic records, make sure the retention schedules are followed, and allow you to share content with the public. And we can help you figure out the alphabet soup that goes along with all these variety of resources. If this type of system sounds good to you, but you don't actually want to manage it yourself, you might be able to partner with another entity that'll act as a system administrator. This type of arrangement is not uncommon for local governments. In addition to choosing the system that you will be using to store the records, you should also think about who's going to be responsible for supporting the devices upon which the files are actually saved. Options include buying your own servers or purchasing space on those owned and maintained by another entity, which Vincent mentioned when he was talking about storing things in the cloud. And some systems are going to feel almost exactly like what you're navigating on your computer desktop. You know, it's a very shallow learning curve. Others are visually very different. I mean, you open up, it's like, what is this thing? But once you get acclimated to it, are going to be really easy to use. So don't hesitate to request demos from multiple vendors or talk to your colleagues at other government entities about what they use. The state archives can also provide you with lists of systems that we know have been used successfully by government entities in New York. Now, just disclosure, we do not endorse any systems, but we can tell you that, oh yeah, somebody else has used this and you can talk to them for more information. Or we've heard, that people have been successful with this system. So you might want to talk to their vendor, but obviously that does not constitute an endorsement. As you're going through your planning your digitization project, you're going to want to consider how files are named and organized within any system you acquire. A poorly named or located file isn't necessarily a lost file, but it's certainly more frustrating to find than one that is well described and appropriately placed. Ensuring that you can access and use digital records for the full length of the associated retention period isn't just about where you store the documents and how you describe them, though. It's also about the files themselves. So, checking the clock, I think we got a minute for a quick story. Back in the 90s, I wrote an awful lot of papers using a word processing program called AmiPro. While it is technically possible that I could, using the right software, access these again, I'm really happy that I don't need to because it'd be an utter pain in the neck. To minimize this pain for yourself and your successors, because who wants to go through that to, access the documents you need to do in the course of business rather than to see what goofy things you were saying in your papers in high school and as an undergrad. You're going to want to, whenever possible, choose file formats that will stand the test of time. And these are the ones that are non-proprietary or open, which means that you can still access them once the software that you're currently using is no longer supported, and those that use lossless compression, meaning that all file data is saved. The opposite is going to be file formats that are considered lossy. For these, data that is considered less important is discarded in order to reduce overall file size. The problem with lossy compression is that it degrades the file and may make it more difficult to retrieve all the informational content, especially if you need to convert it from one file format to another to maintain accessibility over time. As of the time of this session, December 2023, the State Archives recommends 3 different file formats for digitized records. TIFFs, which stands for Tag Image File Format. You're probably familiar with this one if you dabble in photography or graphic arts. PDFs, which stands for Portable Document Format. If you've accessed a document online, it's probably in this format, including our guidance documents at the State Archives website. There's also a variant on PDFs called PDFAs, or Portable Digital Format Archival. As you can probably guess from the name, we recommend these over PDFs for digital content that will be retained for a longer period of time, anything over 10 years. But why? Well, PDFAs have two major advantages over regular PDFs. They're more difficult to modify, reducing the likelihood that content will be added, deleted, or otherwise changed. And more significantly, they save more information within the file itself. For example, normal PDFs may save a notation that says, this text should be in color X and font Y. The file then needs to pull information about what exactly color X and font Y are to accurately replicate the file. This saves space, but means that you need to be able to access content outside the file to accurately render the document. PDFAs, on the other hand, embed the fonts within the document itself, which means that the file doesn't need to reference any outside information before accurately rendering the image. Because of this, one thing you need to be aware of is that while you can convert a PDFA to a fully functional PDF, PDFs can't be used to generate useful PDFAs. That information is already gone. So instead, you're going to want to create your PDFAs straight from the source document. In addition to file format, you're going to want to consider what resolution is right for your document. Saving files to a lower resolution, which means fewer pixels than are used to render the image, means that image quality won't be as crisp and detailed. Text saved at a very low resolution will likely be a bit more difficult to read and may even look a little blurry. But since more detail means bigger files, saving at a higher resolution than necessary means huge files that contain way more data than needed to render an image clearly, taking up space on your servers or in the cloud storage that you're paying for. When in doubt, a resolution of 300 pixels per inch, or PPI, is usually the sweet spot for text-based documents. Large format maps and plans should usually be imaged at a resolution between 300 and 600 ppi, depending on the level of detail that needs to be captured. All this information is memorialized within the State Archives imaging guidelines. Please note that the guidelines are currently under review. So if you want to receive notification of changes, should we update the guidelines, sign up for our state agency or local government newsletter, which also contains all kinds of great information about other guidance we're providing, updates to our website, upcoming events like this one today. And we only send it out about once a month, so don't worry about being spammed. And now I'm going to hand you back to Vincent.
Thanks, Monica. So, who should do this work? As with so many things in life, you have two options. You can do it yourself, or you can pay someone else to do it. With regard to digital imaging, you can either purchase the scanner or scanners, train staff on how to use them and how to prepare records prior to scanning, because there's nothing like watching a scanner's auto feeder rip a page because you missed a staple when prepping the records, or you can pay a vendor to do it for you. Many offices adopt a hybrid approach and scan new content as it comes in, but hire a vendor for their backlog, where they opt to scan standard size documents in-house, but hire a vendor to scan large format records. Although scanning in-house may seem like the most cost-effective approach, folks are being paid to be in the office anyway, right? The speed and quality offered by the vendors often makes it worth sending out your backlogs for replication. Because vendors image a much higher volume of records than any one office, they're also able to purchase and dedicate space from multiple types of scanners specifically designed for different record sizes and conditions. Because of this variety, your records may be scanned more quickly and with less chance of damage occurring. If you decide to go with a vendor, you should probably start by getting a quote from an entity that meets the definition of preferred source under the state finance law. As of the date of this recording, there are two preferred source vendors for digital imaging: New York State Industries for the Disabled, or NYSID, and New York State Preferred Source Program for New Yorkers who are blind, or NYSPSP. When agreeing to terms with a vendor, you should make sure that the contract includes language verifying that the records to be imaged are your records, not the vendor's, and that the content will be protected from disclosure and not shared or saved elsewhere by the vendor. This should be standard. You're also going to want to consider whether you might need to access records while they're in the vendor's custody and how quickly the vendor can respond to such requests. Believe it or not, sometimes you're going to need them and need those produced, if not immediately, within 24 hours anyway, so effectively immediately. Be sure to obtain a cost estimate containing a breakdown by activity and per page, right? How much does it cost per page to do this activity? This is especially important if you're a local government wishing to fund your imaging project through a local government records management improvement fund grant. The more details that you have, your quotes, the more information that you have, the stronger your application will be, right? Now, let's talk about equipment. As I said, vendors can be a better choice for certain projects because they can justify the funding and space necessary to store multiple types of scanners. But what if you need to image in-house? What if you want to be able to understand why a vendor may use one type of scanner over another? It's good to know what the vendor is doing on your behalf, right? It's time for everyone's favorite topic. And as was said, I'm of course talking about equipment. Most standard office documents can be imaged using either a flatbed or sheet-fed scanner. Flatbeds are good for imaging most anything of limited physical size, even if it's fragile or easily bent, because the record remains stationary during the scanning process. You can lay it down gently, close the lid upon it, and be pretty confident that your original won't be damaged. Another great thing about flatbed scanners is that they're usually the least expensive scanner type. Downsides of flatbeds are, and follow me step by step here, all that's entailed in the process: the lifting of the lid, the placing of the document, the setting of the lid back upon the document, flipping the document if it's two-sided, and removing the document. All of that means that there's a high time per image requirement. Sheet-fed scanners are the next step up. While they're not great for fragile things, they're fantastic if you want to scan multiple pages of standard office paper, some of it with content on both sides very quickly. This, and the fact that you can load multiple pages into the hopper at once, is why they're the most popular type of scanner for standard office applications, despite being more expensive than flatbeds. The problem is, unlike flatbeds, they can rip documents or jam repeatedly while auto-feeding, both of which can be a nightmare. I think the moral of the document or sheet-fed scanners debate is that despite being automated, they still require attention while the scanning is occurring. If you are scanning en masse using one of these, do not take your lunch break. It'll hopefully be easy to find room in your office for a flatbed or sheet-fed scanner, or dare I say it, both of them, and both of which can fit quite tidily on a standard desk. You can set up dedicated scanning stations or purchase scanners for multiple staff to keep on their desk. This has become fairly standard in many offices, many county clerks, other kinds of clerks. If you go to the bank, you'll often see little scanners on desks. This is pretty common by now. So, what about the photocopier? Is that a good option for scanning records? Well, some copiers have scanning functionality. They're not necessarily a great choice for imaging records en masse. Photocopiers may have limited options for file format and resolution, and it may be more challenging to change these settings than it is on a scanner, and may involve the vendor from whom you either purchased or leased the photocopier from. I've had to do this myself when we realized that we weren't scanning in the office I worked in the State Archives standard. I had to call the vendor from whom we were leasing the equipment. They had to come in and change the settings to 300 dpi. There's also the issue of an image of everything you scan being saved to the photocopier's hard drive. You need to be confident that the photocopier hard drive will be wiped of protected content before it leaves your office. Finally, I know that I wouldn't want to be competing with my colleagues for photocopier access when I'm working on a long-term project. That's a recipe for frustration. So now everything that we've talked about so far works well enough for standard office documents. But what about the big stuff Monica mentioned a few minutes ago? How do you scan maps, plans, and other oversized content? And what about fragile bound materials like registers or oversized volumes? Any county clerk, staff, or personnel on this webinar today listening in or watching or whatever, think of deed books, right? Those old school deed books. They're huge. What do you do with them? For maps and plans that aren't terribly fragile, you can use a wide format scanner. From experience, I can warn you that the roller will sometimes pull things in crooked, which can lead to tearing and folding. They're also kind of on the slow side, especially when you account for the time needed to line the document up correctly and sort of monitor the whole thing. Now, I've seen each of the 4 previous device types in a standard office setting. This 5th one that I'm about to mention is a bit more rare. That's a planetary or orbital scanner. Planetary or orbital scanners are used to scan a document from above, with no need to touch or move it once it's laid out on the scanner. While it can only scan one document at a time, it's great for things that are large, fragile, or bound. It may take a bit more effort to find a vendor who has planetary scanners, but they are out there. Back to you, Monica.
Thanks, Vincent. Whether you scan in-house or contract out the work, there are certain steps that you're going to have to take to ensure project success. I've got them here, but don't worry, we're going to go over them each in turn. First, before you do anything, you're going to want to develop a project plan. This is where you determine all the details necessary to run the project successfully. It not only helps you make sure that the project is going to meet your goals and that you're going to avoid issues, but it's also going to help you bring in your colleagues as supporters and willing participants. And by promoting this project, you're asking your colleagues to dedicate time, funding, and energy to it. Your project plan shows them that you've thought things through, have identified the decisions you have to make, and challenges that are likely to be encountered, and seriously considered the best ways to address them. You're going to want your likely supporters and teammates to be confident that the project will be a success, and creating and sharing a plan is one of the best ways to do so. If you haven't already done so, you're going to want to perform an inventory of the records that will be processed as part of the plan. Determine total volume and verify whether they need special care due to their condition. You're also going to want to note the record age and whether a portion can be weeded because they're past their disposition date, or if they're so close to being disposed of that it's simply not worth imaging them. Once you have a handle on which records you're going to image, you should determine what type of preparation they need pre-imaging and how long that'll take. For example, if records are well documented and well organized and there are no staples, clips, or other fasteners to remove, they might require minimal preparation. Documents that are riddled with fasteners, folded or rolled, will require significantly more time to prepare. Estimate 1 hour per 1,000 pages and adjust based upon actual record condition. As records are processed, you're going to want to make sure that the resulting images meet your quality standards. This means checking the scanner settings every day or possibly multiple times a day to make sure that they match your specifications and routinely checking that pages aren't skipped or skewed or that you're not getting spots, stripes, and other visual noise on the scans due to gunk on the scanner parts. This quality control can be performed by the vendor or if you're imaging in-house by government staff and is meant to detect problems quickly so that you can adjust equipment settings or rescan images before too many unacceptable scans are made. In addition, you're going to need to perform verification of the documents post-imaging to make sure that no issues were overlooked during the quality control phase. If you're keeping all the paper copies and can reference them in an emergency, then you can get away with sampling or comparing only a small percentage of the imaged pages against the paper originals to make sure that the reproduction is acceptable. If you're planning on destroying the paper copies prior to the end of the retention period, though, and are going to be relying on the electronic copies for access, your review is going to have to be much more aggressive. Current State Archives guidance as of December 2023 is that you must visually inspect all images of records whose paper originals are slated for destruction before disposing of the paper copies. I know this sounds like a ton of effort, And for large-scale projects, it can be. But this is the only way to ensure that you're not going to lose access to content and risk not only wasted time and expense of having to recreate content, let alone the embarrassment of having to do it, but also the potential fees and public relations impacts associated with not being able to produce content in response to litigation or an audit. And just really quickly, while the quality control that happens on an ongoing basis during the project can be completed by a vendor, this final verification needs to be completed by government staff. Because not only are you checking that your records that you're responsible are going to remain accessible, you're making sure that the vendor held up their end of the bargain and they met their contractual requirements. Because if the vendor messed up, they're going to have to fix it, and you're going to have enough information to know whether you need to make that request. Last but not least, once you've imaged your records, you need to ensure that they're named, indexed, foldered, and tagged such that staff can find them quickly. Developing filing schemes and naming conventions should be a group effort that begins before the first document is imaged and involved a representative sample of internal document creators and users. Although creating filing schemes and naming conventions is beyond the scope of this webinar, please don't hesitate to contact State Archive staff for guidance and resource recommendations. And now I'm turning you back over to Vincent, who's going to bring us into the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Monica. So let's sort of summarize the session here. What are our takeaways? I know that we've covered a lot of content during the past 50 or so minutes, but to wrap things up, while digitizing your physical records can be a great way to improve access and simplify business processes, it's not always appropriate for all offices, records, or situations. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. We gave you a number of things to think about and consider before taking the plunge. You should do that for any of these projects. When selecting records for digitization, you should consider factors including retention periods, how long you have to keep something at a minimum, frequency of access, right? How often are people needing to look at this stuff and utilize it? And the need for remote access, right? So do people who aren't on site need to access this stuff? Before launching a program, determine which staff will be the most effective, for lack of a better term, guinea pigs, canaries in the coal mine. And also that while in-house imaging may seem easiest and least expensive, using a vendor is often both cost-effective and likely to result in quality work product, right? Because think about it, if you have to consider that if staff are dedicating their time to doing this, that means they're not doing something else. And maybe that's fine. You have to assess it case by case. But if that something else has a sense of urgency or timeliness behind it, they're going to end up being pulled from the work anyway. Go and do the more urgent matter, and the project is going to sort of move choppily. And there's something to be said for being able to work on such projects uninterrupted. Also, make sure to create and follow a plan that ensures that imaged records, those records which you scan, digitize, whatever, are usable and accessible for the full required retention period. Doing one of these projects isn't going to work if you need to keep something for 25 years and you don't have the sort of infrastructure and best practices in place to ensure that what you've imaged actually lasts 25 years, right? It defeats the purpose, especially if you turn around and destroy the paper, right? That's true for those of you who might image permanent records. I mentioned marriage records a while ago. I've also done deed volumes en masse. If you turn around and were to destroy those deed volumes because you've imaged everything and indexed it well, you need to make sure that, now that's the record copy effectively, you need to make sure that lasts. Okay, so with that, here's contact information, and it should be in the PowerPoint slides that everyone's being emailed or have been emailed for the scheduling and state agency service unit, of which I'm a part, but also for all of the records advisory officers here at the State Archives, including Monica. So you have that. And are there any questions today?
Hi, Vincent and Monica. Yes, we have one question. I was actually going to suggest you might want to, if you could go back to that previous slide, Vincent. I know folks like to see that information.
Sure.
So we'll just leave that. But thank you. Yes, I have a question here from Dana. Do you have a list of preferred large format printers for local government offices?
I can answer that, Rich. We do not specifically maintain a list, but there are a few things you can do to gain that information. First, you're going to want to make sure that any scanner that you acquire um, allows you to meet the criteria within our digital imaging guidelines. I just included a link to that in our chat. You can also contact the state archives, either state agency services or your RAO. We can both find out what our colleagues on the 11th floor at the archives use for imaging our records in-house. And, we can reach out to other government entities. Like, I could contact the counties that I work with and say, what do you guys use? How do you like it? Is there anything that you would recommend? And then we can share that information with you.
Okay, thank you, Monica. So we don't I don't see any other questions, but we do have about 4 minutes left. So if anybody has any questions that they're typing in, we have a question here from Bob. Do you have recommended examples of file naming and organizing for records kept by towns and villages?
I'll answer that one too. I could talk your ear off for 2 hours about naming conventions. If you are interested specifically in town and village records, if you haven't already established a relationship with Michael Martin, the Records Advisory Officer for Towns, and Maria McCashin, who is the interim Records Advisory Officer for Villages, I highly recommend you do so. They're both fantastic. And they will be able to give you some examples or help you come up with examples that work for your office based upon how your colleagues think about the records and describe them.
Yeah, definitely put them on speed dial.
All right, let's see. We have a question here from Maria. Born digital forms/records and imaging of original records should be protected by the LGS1 retention code on the system/program you are using, correct?
I'll answer that one too, since it's a local government question. The retention items within the LGS1 are based upon the function of the record. And it doesn't matter what format they're in, whether it's content that's saved in a database, whether it's paper copies, microfilm, microfiche, digital copies, or whatnot. So you would retain the individual records according to the retention code relevant to the type of content contained within the record and the function it serves for your government.
Okay, we have a question from Anne. Do you have a list of common records types that require paper copies to be maintained?
I'm going to save you from this one too, Vincent. I do not maintain a list,
Who's
honestly.
Vincent?
Honestly, whenever a question like this comes up, either I've been asked it before or I need to do a little bit of research. And what it comes down to is if it's something where you're just kind of queasy about it, it makes sense to ask, whether it's asking state archive staff or talking to your council or talking to um, the entity that has oversight function. Like, for example, I've had questions about election records, or I mentioned the DMV issuance of the vehicle titles. I've had questions about those before. I've had questions about deeds and other records related to land transactions and ownership. So unfortunately, we don't have an exhaustive list at this time, but don't hesitate to contact either council, the oversight entity on the state level, or state archive staff for guidance on specific record types.
And I would just add that, from my experience with some digitizing record series for county government, that even I cited two examples, marriage records and deeds, both of which are permanent. It was our understanding at that time that if properly digitized according to the state archive standards and if properly indexed, and I'll mention a little bit more about that in a minute, just to give people a sense of what that entails, that you could eliminate or dispose of the originals, right? That the electronic copies would now become authoritative. This was half dozen years ago or whatever. But we opted not to because the records had such importance that we were afraid that if we missed something, which statistically, of course, we missed something, we're talking about tens of thousands of certificates, tens of thousands, maybe more of deeds over, in some cases, literally centuries. We just didn't think it was worth the risk. So we were risk averse on that. And if we ever have to go back to the paper was for the most part in good enough condition that it still had plenty of shelf life left and we had the space, we were able to do that. But I'm going to defer to Monica. If you don't have those luxuries and you feel like you're feeling the squeeze, then definitely talk to who you need to talk to see what your options are. But I will say that for those projects, the biggest time drain was the indexing. Not even just verifying the images, but making sure that the indexing information, right, the last name, the marriage certificate number, the deed year and number or whatever, that all of that had been entered properly by the vendor because that's what they were on the hook for as per the contract. And when there were errors, basically documenting those errors and correcting them. So it was a huge, the biggest part of that process was getting the indexing right. Because even if the image was a little messed up or something like that, which not good, we should definitely fix that. At least we could find it. So if you're planning these projects, do it at a scale such that your staff can actually do the indexing. I'm a little rusty on the algorithm, but when I used to do it, the local government still had to, part of what they would often do was do the indexing themselves or verify that the indexing had been done correctly. So that's critical and it's a huge time drain. So you have to plan for that.
Okay, given the time, we just have time for one more question, and I'm gonna, for those folks who we didn't get to, we apologize, but you can certainly contact us, contact the folks that you see on the screen. I have a question here from Agnes. Generally, if using a vendor to scan, do you have to have a particular program to store them for retrieval, or do they scan you and send you files? And do they name the files, or do we name the files?
You mind if I take this one, Vincent?
Go ahead and bat lead off.
Okay. You can have the vendor store things in a particular system. You can have them put everything on an external hard drive. You can have them organize the files for return to you in whatever way works best for you. But you're going to want to consider whether there's a way to build into the process that the vendor is completing a way to reduce work completed by your staff once the records are back, in your custody. Like, for example, you asked about whether you should name files or have the vendor name files. If you can create naming conventions or create an index of the records and let the vendor apply the correct name to the file as it's created, that is going to make it easier to identify the records, verify the records, and it's going to save so much time for staff in your office. And it's not going to cause the vendor much more time per record than it would if they were just giving it random names. So it's really going to be more cost effective and time effective to have the vendor name the records based upon criteria that you create and provide to them.
And if you have an index already built that you utilize, and that's electronic, it's been my experience that sometimes they can take that and run with it, and it's will save money, time, and thus money for them because they don't have to go through and systematically enter all the data in. They can kind of line everything up, the data from the index to the image. There's ways of doing that. So there's a lot they can do based on your situation.
Okay, and with that, I'd like to thank everybody for their participation. The recording of this webinar will hopefully be available by Friday, and you can certainly find it on our website or on the New York State Archives YouTube page. Any last words, Monica or Vincent?
Never be shy to contact State Archive staff. Sometimes I get people who think that they're wasting my time or asking a silly question, but this is why we exist, to help you and to help you manage your records correctly. And every question you ask us is just justifying the existence of, each of us in our roles, which frankly, I hope I can speak for Vincent, we enjoy having. So let us keep doing the job we love.
Yes, we love being members of the guild, and we love it when people come to us asking for advice. We like to help. It is in our nature.
Thanks, everybody.